He conquered the known world before turning 30. From Greece to India, his empire stretched farther than anyone before him. But was Alexander the Great truly the ultimate general? Or just a legend shaped by history? Let's find out. History is filled with extraordinary figures, people who seem to defy the limits of what is possible. Alexander the Great is one of them. He was a man who carved out one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever seen before his 33rd birthday. His story is not just one of battles and conquests. It is a tale of immense ambition, relentless drive, and a legend that has echoed through millennia. Born in 356 BC in Pella, the capital of the Kingdom of Macedon, Alexander was no ordinary prince. He was the son of King Philip II, a brilliant military and political strategist in his own right, and Olympias, a princess from the neighboring kingdom of Epirus. Theirs was a powerful, if volatile, union that placed Alexander at the very heart of Balkan power politics from the moment he drew his first breath. The world Alexander was born into was a crucible of change. His father, Philip, had transformed Macedon from a peripheral, semi-barbaric kingdom into a formidable military power. He had reformed the army, introducing the fearsome sarissa pike and the disciplined phalanx formation that would become the backbone of Alexander's future victories. Philip was a master of diplomacy and warfare, a king who united the fractured Greek city-states, sometimes by force, sometimes by persuasion, under the banner of the League of Corinth. Alexander grew up watching his father operate, learning the ruthless calculus of power from a master. He was not just a prince waiting for a throne, he was an apprentice learning a very dangerous trade at the highest possible level. His mother, Olympias, was a formidable figure who instilled in him a different kind of belief. She was a devout woman, a follower of mystical Dionysian cults, and she was fiercely protective of her son's destiny. Legend has it that she told Alexander his true father was not Philip, but the king of the gods, Zeus himself. Whether Alexander truly believed this or simply used it as a powerful tool of propaganda, it shaped his perception of himself. He was encouraged to see himself as a descendant of heroes, tracing his lineage on his mother's side to the great Achilles, the ultimate warrior of Greek myth. This sense of divine favor and heroic destiny would fuel his ambition and give him an almost superhuman confidence in the face of overwhelming odds. From a young age, Alexander displayed the qualities that would define his life. He was intelligent, charismatic, and possessed a fiery spirit. The famous story of him taming the wild stallion, Bucephalus, a horse no one else could ride, is a perfect illustration of his character. While others used force, a young Alexander noticed the horse was afraid of its own shadow. He simply turned the horse towards the sun, calmed it, and rode it, winning his father's proud admiration. This was more than just a boy taming a horse. It was a demonstration of insight, patience, and courage. For his formal education, Philip hired the greatest mind of the age, the philosopher Aristotle, who taught Alexander rhetoric, literature, science, and philosophy, shaping the mind of the boy who would one day try to conquer the world. In 336 BC, the world of Alexander was shattered. His father, King Philip II, was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards during a public celebration. The motive for the murder is still debated by historians today. Was it a personal grievance? Or was it a political conspiracy, perhaps involving Alexander's own mother, Olympias, who had fallen out of favor with Philip? Whatever the cause, the effect was immediate and dramatic. At just 20 years old, Alexander was thrust onto the throne of Macedon. He inherited not just a kingdom and a powerful army, but also a host of enemies and a great deal of uncertainty. His father's sudden death created a power vacuum, and many saw an opportunity to challenge the young, untested king. Alexander's response was swift and utterly ruthless. He knew that any sign of weakness would be fatal. His first actions were to secure his own position at home. He moved quickly to eliminate any potential rivals to the throne, executing relatives and nobles he suspected of disloyalty. This was a brutal but necessary consolidation of power, sending a clear message that he was now in absolute command. But the challenges were not just internal. News of Philip's death had spread like wildfire across Greece, and the city-states that his father had so painstakingly brought under Macedonian control saw their chance to break free. Thebes, a powerful and proud city, led the rebellion, believing the boy king would be no match for them. This was Alexander's first great test as a leader, and he did not hesitate. Instead of engaging in long negotiations or cautious maneuvers, he acted with breathtaking speed. He marched his army south at a pace that stunned his enemies, covering hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks. When he arrived at the gates of Thebes, he offered terms, but the city refused, underestimating his resolve. Alexander's response was terrifying. He unleashed his army on the city, ordering it to be razed to the ground. Thousands were killed, and the rest of the population, some 30,000 people, were sold into slavery. The destruction of Thebes was a horrific act of violence, but as a political statement, it was brutally effective. The message echoed across the Greek world. Rebellion against Alexander would not be tolerated. The other city-states, including a nervous Athens, quickly fell back in line, reaffirming their allegiance to him. With Greece now pacified and his authority unquestioned, Alexander could turn his attention to his father's ultimate ambition. Philip had been preparing a massive invasion of the Persian Empire, the superpower of the age, to avenge the Persian invasions of Greece a century and a half earlier. Alexander inherited this grand project. He was now not just the king of Macedon and the leader of the Greeks. He was the commander of an army poised to march into Asia and challenge the mightiest empire on earth. The forging of the king was complete. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander the Great stood on the shores of Europe and looked across the narrow strait of the Hellespont towards Asia. He was leading an army of around 40,000 men, a coalition of Macedonians and Greeks, to invade an empire that stretched for thousands of miles and could field armies many times larger. It was a monumental gamble. Alexander was a charismatic leader, but many of his soldiers were veterans who had served his father, and they were putting their faith in a 22-year-old king with limited battlefield experience. As he made the crossing, Alexander hurled a spear into Asian soil, symbolically claiming the continent for himself. He then visited the site of ancient Troy, making sacrifices at the supposed tomb of his hero Achilles, connecting his own campaign to the epic stories of the past. The Persian response was to gather an army to confront him. The local Persian governors, known as satraps, assembled a force of cavalry and Greek mercenaries near the Granicus River. They made a critical mistake. Instead of waiting for the main imperial army under their king, Darius III, they chose to fight Alexander with the forces they had at hand. They positioned their troops on the steep eastern bank of the river, believing the difficult terrain would give them a decisive advantage against Alexander's advancing infantry. They assumed the young king would be cautious, that he would wait to cross under the cover of darkness or find an easier fording point. They did not yet understand the man they were facing. Alexander arrived at the Granicus in the afternoon and immediately saw the flaw in the Persian deployment. Their cavalry was lined up at the top of the riverbank, but their infantry was held back far behind them. This meant that if he could break through the cavalry line, there would be nothing to stop his momentum. Against the advice of his more cautious generals, who urged him to wait until the next morning, Alexander ordered an immediate attack. He knew that audacity and surprise were his greatest weapons. He led the charge himself, at the head of his elite companion cavalry, plunging into the river and fighting his way up the muddy, slippery bank under a hail of enemy javelins. The fighting was ferocious. Alexander was in the thick of it, a conspicuous figure in his magnificent armor and plumed helmet. At one point, he was struck on the head by a Persian nobleman's axe, his helmet cracking under the blow. Before the Persian could strike again, Alexander was saved by one of his commanders, Clytus the Black, who cut the attacker down. This moment of personal danger only seemed to fuel the Macedonian assault. Alexander's cavalry crashed into the Persian lines, shattering their formation. The Persian horsemen, thrown into confusion, broke and fled. The Greek mercenaries in Persian service, who had been watching from the rear, were now isolated and surrounded. Alexander showed them no mercy, and most were cut down where they stood. The Battle of the Granicus was a stunning victory, won by sheer boldness, and it opened the whole of Asia Minor to his army. After his victory at the Granicus, Alexander spent the next year systematically securing the western coast of Asia Minor. This was a crucial strategic move, as it denied the powerful Persian navy its key bases, preventing them from sailing into the Aegean and stirring up trouble in Greece behind his back. By 333 BC, he was ready to push deeper into the heart of the Persian Empire. The Persian king, Darius III, could no longer rely on his local governors. He had gathered a massive imperial army, drawn from all corners of his vast realm, and marched to confront the Macedonian invader himself. It was to be a showdown between the two kings, a personal duel for the fate of an empire. Darius chose his ground carefully, or so he thought. He positioned his enormous army on a wide, open plain where his numerical superiority, especially in cavalry, could be used to its full advantage. However, Alexander, in a brilliant move, outmaneuvered him. He marched his army past Darius's position, forcing the Persian king to abandon his chosen battlefield and follow him. Darius, eager for a decisive battle, fell into the trap. The two armies finally met near the town of Issus, on a narrow coastal plain squeezed between the mountains and the sea. This terrain was a disaster for Darius. The narrowness of the battlefield meant he could not deploy all of his troops at once, completely nullifying his numerical advantage. The Battle of Issus began with the two armies facing each other across a small river. Alexander's army was significantly outnumbered, perhaps by as much as 2-1, but they were battle-hardened veterans in a tight, disciplined formation. Darius placed himself in the center of his line, as was the Persian royal tradition, surrounded by his best infantry and the royal bodyguard. Alexander, as always, took his position on the right wing, at the head of his companion cavalry. He saw that the Persian left flank was weak and that Darius himself was a vulnerable, high-value target. His entire strategy for the battle became focused on one single audacious goal: a direct charge at the Persian king. When the battle commenced, Alexander once again led the charge. He angled his cavalry away from the main clash of infantry in the center and smashed into the Persian left wing. The Persian line crumpled under the force of the Macedonian charge. Alexander then wheeled his cavalry inwards, carving a path directly towards the center of the Persian army and the location of Darius's chariot. The sight of Alexander and his elite horsemen, covered in the dust and blood of battle, charging directly at him was too much for Darius. In a moment of panic that would seal his fate, the great king of Persia turned his chariot and fled the battlefield. His flight triggered a collapse in morale throughout the Persian army, which dissolved into a chaotic rout. The victory was total, and Alexander captured Darius's camp, including his mother, wife, and children, whom he treated with great respect. Following the spectacular victory at Issus, the path to the Persian heartland lay open. However, I chose not to pursue Darius immediately. Instead, I continued my strategy of securing the Mediterranean coastline. I marched my army south through Syria and Phoenicia, determined to neutralize the last vestiges of the Persian navy. Most cities surrendered to me without a fight, welcoming me as a change from Persian rule. But one city stood defiant: the island fortress of Tyre. The Tyrians were masters of the sea and believed their island walls were impregnable. They refused to submit, forcing me into one of the most remarkable sieges in military history. The siege of Tyre lasted for 7 months. Since I could not assault the island from the sea, I decided to bring the land to the island. I ordered my engineers to build a massive causeway, a stone and timber mole stretching half a mile across the water to the city walls. It was honestly an incredible feat of engineering, undertaken under constant attack from the Tyrian navy and defenders on the walls. The Tyrians sent fire ships to burn my siege towers and launched raids on my workers. But I was relentless. I brought in my own ships from other conquered cities, built even larger siege towers, and eventually, after months of grueling effort, my soldiers breached the walls. My punishment for their defiance was as brutal as it had been at Thebes. The city was sacked, and its people were either killed or sold into slavery. After the fall of Tyre and a shorter siege at Gaza, I marched into Egypt in 332 BC. Here, my reception was completely different. The Egyptians had long resented Persian rule, viewing the Persians as oppressive foreign masters who disrespected their gods and traditions. They welcomed me not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The Persian governor of Egypt surrendered without a fight, handing over the entire country and its vast treasury. I showed great political wisdom in my handling of my new domain. I paid respect to the Egyptian gods, made sacrifices at their temples, and presented myself as a legitimate successor to the native pharaohs. This all culminated in one of the most significant journeys of my life. I trekked deep into the Libyan desert to visit the famous oracle of the god Amun-Ra at Siwa. The priests of the oracle greeted me as the son of the god, confirming the divine ancestry my mother Olympias had always claimed. This was really a masterstroke of propaganda, elevating my status from a mere king to that of a living god in the eyes of my new Egyptian subjects. Before leaving Egypt, I founded a new city on the coast where the Nile meets the Mediterranean. I named it Alexandria. It was a perfectly located port, designed to be a center of trade and culture. I could not have known it then, but this city would become one of the greatest intellectual and cultural capitals of the ancient world for centuries to come, a lasting testament to my vision. With Egypt secure and the entire eastern Mediterranean under his control, Alexander was finally ready to deliver the death blow to the Persian Empire. In 331 BC, he marched his army out of Egypt, crossed the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, and advanced into the heartland of Mesopotamia. King Darius III had used the intervening 2 years to raise another, even larger army. He had learned from his mistakes at Issus. This time, he would not be caught in a narrow space. He chose a vast, perfectly flat plain near a village called Gaugamela, where he could deploy his immense forces and use his scythed chariots and cavalry to their full potential. This was to be the final decisive battle for control of Asia. Darius's army was a truly colossal force, with estimates suggesting he may have had as many as 250,000 men, dwarfing Alexander's army of fewer than 50,000. The night before the battle, Alexander's generals were nervous. His second-in-command, Parmenion, suggested a night attack to surprise the Persians, but Alexander refused. "I will not steal my victory," he famously declared. He was supremely confident in his soldiers, his strategy, and himself. He allowed his men a full night's rest while the Persian army, fearing a surprise attack, remained standing in formation all night, becoming exhausted before the battle had even begun. This was a psychological victory for Alexander, before a single sword was drawn. As the sun rose on the day of the battle, the sheer scale of the Persian army was revealed. It stretched for miles across the plain. Alexander advanced with his army at an angle, baiting the Persian cavalry on their left wing to charge. As they did, Alexander opened up a gap in his own line, luring the Persian horsemen into a trap, where they were engaged and neutralized by his reserves. This maneuver created a crucial opening in the main Persian front line, near the center where Darius was positioned. This was the moment Alexander had been waiting for. Just as he had done at Issus, he formed his companion cavalry into a wedge and led a devastating charge directly at that gap. The charge was perfectly timed and executed with terrifying speed. Alexander and his horsemen smashed through the Persian royal guard, aiming once again for Darius himself. For the second time, the king of Persia was confronted with the sight of Alexander charging directly towards him, and for the second time, he panicked and fled. His flight once again shattered the morale of the Persian center and left. While the Macedonian left wing under Parmenion was in serious trouble, desperately holding off a massive Persian cavalry assault, Alexander's decisive charge had already won the battle. After routing the center, he wheeled around to support Parmenion and complete the victory. The Persian army disintegrated. The Battle of Gaugamela was Alexander's greatest military masterpiece, a triumph of strategy and courage against impossible odds. What was it that made Alexander the Great such an unparalleled military commander? It was not one single quality, but a combination of traits that made him a force of nature on the battlefield. First and foremost was his personal courage. Alexander never led from the rear. He was always at the front, in the most dangerous part of the battle, sharing the risks with his men. This inspired incredible loyalty and devotion. His soldiers saw that he was willing to fight and bleed just as they were, and they would follow him anywhere. His numerous battle scars were a testament to his bravery, a map of his campaigns written on his own body. He understood that true leadership is demonstrated, not just declared. Another key quality was his strategic genius and tactical flexibility. Alexander was a brilliant planner who could see the bigger picture. His decision to secure the Mediterranean coast before marching inland is a prime example of his long-term thinking. But he was also a master of improvisation on the battlefield. At the Granicus, he attacked immediately against his advisor's counsel. At Issus, he used the narrow terrain to his advantage. At Gaugamela, he developed a complex plan to create a gap in the enemy line. He was not rigid. He could read the flow of a battle and adapt his tactics in an instant to exploit a sudden opportunity or counter an unexpected threat. This ability to think on his feet made him unpredictable and deadly. Beyond his military prowess, Alexander possessed immense charisma and a deep understanding of psychology. He knew how to motivate his men, using stirring speeches that appealed to their pride, their greed, and their sense of honor. He knew every one of his senior commanders by name, and would often walk through the camp before a battle, speaking to ordinary soldiers and boosting their morale. He also understood the power of propaganda. The story of his divine birth, his visit to the oracle at Siwa, and his emulation of heroes like Achilles were all carefully crafted to build his legend and create an aura of invincibility. He was selling his men and the world, a story in which he was the hero destined for greatness. Finally, Alexander's relentless ambition and unwavering self-belief were perhaps his most defining characteristics. He simply did not believe in limits. After conquering the Persian Empire, an achievement that would have satisfied any other ruler, he wanted to march to the ends of the world. This drive pushed his army across mountains and deserts, into modern-day Afghanistan and India, to lands the Greeks had never seen. While this relentless ambition eventually exhausted his men, it was the engine that powered his conquests. He possessed a vision of a new world, a Hellenistic empire blending Greek and Eastern cultures, and he had the absolute conviction that he, and he alone, could make it a reality. To his enemies, Alexander the Great was a terrifying and destructive force. To the Persians he fought, he was an usurper, a ruthless invader who had toppled their ancient monarchy and burned their sacred capital, Persepolis. The destruction of this magnificent ceremonial city in 330 BC was a hugely symbolic act. While some sources say it was a deliberate act of revenge for the burning of Athens by the Persians a century before, others describe it as a drunken act during a wild party. Either way, for the Persians, it was a brutal demonstration of his power and a deep cultural humiliation. To cities like Thebes and Tyre that dared to defy him, he was a merciless destroyer who brought death and enslavement. Even among his own men, the view of Alexander was complex and evolved over time. In the early years of the campaign, he was a beloved and inspirational leader. His soldiers adored him for his bravery, his generosity with the spoils of war, and the seemingly unbroken chain of victories he delivered. They were his companions, his comrades in arms on the greatest adventure in history. However, as the years wore on and Alexander pushed them further and further east, far from their homes in Greece and Macedon, discontent began to grow. They were exhausted by the endless marching and fighting. They longed to return home and enjoy the wealth they had won. This growing tension was made worse by Alexander's increasing adoption of Persian customs. He began to wear Persian-style clothing and introduced Persian court rituals, such as proskynesis, the act of bowing or prostrating oneself before the king. To the proud and fiercely independent Greeks and Macedonians, this was deeply offensive. It seemed to them that their king was becoming an Eastern despot and that he was forgetting his own people. This cultural clash led to conspiracies and even murder. Alexander, whose temper was legendary, executed his trusted general Parmenion on suspicion of treason and, in a drunken rage, killed his friend Clitus the Black, the very man who had saved his life at the Granicus, during a heated argument over his new policies. These incidents reveal the darker side of Alexander's character and the immense pressure he was under. He was trying to rule a vast, multicultural empire, and he believed that adopting local customs was a necessary way to win the loyalty of his new subjects. He encouraged his soldiers and officers to marry Persian women, and he himself took a Persian noblewoman, Roxana, as his wife. He was attempting to create a new ruling class, a blend of Macedonian and Persian. This was a visionary policy of fusion, but it was a vision that many of his oldest friends and loyal soldiers could not understand or accept. They had followed him to conquer the world, not to become part of it. The man they saw as a hero was, to some, becoming a tyrant. In 326 BC, Alexander's army reached the Hyphasis River in India, now known as the Bees. They had marched thousands of miles, fought countless battles, and conquered a territory larger than anyone had ever imagined. But here, his men finally reached their limit. They had heard tales of even larger armies and vast kingdoms further east, and they refused to go on. Exhausted, homesick, and weary of their king's endless ambition, the army mutinied. For 3 days, Alexander secluded himself in his tent, angry and disappointed, but he eventually had to accept reality. He could not force his men to march any further. The dream of reaching the Eastern Ocean was over. He turned his army around and began the long, arduous journey back to the heart of his empire. The return journey was one of the most brutal episodes of the entire campaign. A portion of the army sailed down the Indus River and back through the Persian Gulf, but Alexander chose to lead the rest of his forces back by land, marching through the treacherous Gedrosian desert. It was a catastrophic decision. Thousands of his soldiers, along with their families who followed the army, died of heat, thirst, and starvation in the barren wasteland. It was a horrific ordeal that severely damaged his reputation as a commander who cared for his men. When he finally returned to Persia, he was met with news of corruption and mismanagement by the governors he had left in charge. He responded with a series of brutal purges, executing many of them to reassert his authority. He eventually made his way to the great city of Babylon, which he intended to make the capital of his new global empire. He was full of new plans for an expedition to circumnavigate Africa, for the conquest of Arabia, and for further integration of his Greek and Persian subjects. But these grand ambitions would never be realized. In June of 323 BC, after attending a lengthy banquet and drinking party, Alexander fell ill with a sudden and intense fever. He lingered for about 10 days, his condition growing steadily worse until he was unable to speak or move. On June 10th or 11th, Alexander the Great, the conqueror of the known world, died. He was just 32 years old. The exact cause of his death remains a historical mystery, with theories ranging from malaria and typhoid fever to alcohol poisoning or even assassination. His death created an immediate and catastrophic power vacuum. Alexander had built a massive empire, but it was held together entirely by his own genius and personality. When asked on his deathbed to whom he left his kingdom, he supposedly whispered, "To the strongest." Whether he said this or not, it is what happened. His leading generals, known as the Diadochi, or successors, immediately began to fight among themselves for control. His vast empire was torn apart in nearly 50 years of brutal civil war. It was eventually carved up into several new Hellenistic kingdoms, such as the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt and the Seleucid Empire in Asia. Alexander's dream of a unified world died with him, but his legacy endured. He had shattered the old world order and spread Greek language, culture, and ideas across a vast area, initiating a vibrant new historical period known as the Hellenistic Age.